Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in. On this episode of the 2021 Outlook series, host Craig Jeffery continues his interview with Camille Felton, Principal Team Leader of Financial Analytics and Automation at Chick-fil-A, to discuss the future of work told through data stories. Listen into part 2 as they continue their lively conversation around innovative technology solutions through insightful case studies.
Before we go back, I want to talk through another story. You referred to it as the OCR engine, and this is about managing resources and flexibility. Maybe you could tell us the OCR engine story.
Certainly. So as you think about optical character recognition, or OCR, it's about eliminating touch points where possible. So the beauty of OCR is that it reads invoices or documents and ultimately helps you get to the point where you have the data to then do something with it. So for instance, for our invoice processing, so invoice coding, we actually had an OCR engine, but the accuracy of that was very low. In addition to that, we had an OCR engine that was embedded into our ERP, so it really could only be used for invoices flowing through the system. And then when we wanted to tweak that OCR engine, we had to call up IT, tell them, hey, we have some questions here, and we're not really quite sure how to, behind the scenes, fix the accuracy of this OCR engine. In fact, we even heard as we move to cloud, there will be less ability for IT to make changes to that OCR engine as well. So as we thought about use cases for the ERP, but also outside the ERP, we ultimately realized that we needed an additional optical character recognition engine. And so one of those use cases outside of the ERP that we started to action upon was lease invoices. So lease invoices come in, and those are for things like rent or common area maintenance or utilities, and they have to be looked at, opened, reviewed by someone before we ever get it to the point of processing it. So all of the mail is coming in, and I'll tell you some stats here. About 80% of the mail, physical mail that we receive at Chick-fil-A comes to the financial services department. So we knew if we could really open and look at this mail in a more automated fashion using OCR, we could probably get stuff to the ultimate processor or the person that needed that data faster. So we put this OCR engine in place. It is taking a look at all scanned mail. So the mailroom is scanning all of our physical mail now and providing it over to financial services. We then have an OCR engine looking at that data. It's reading it. It's extracting that information that's necessary, and then it's routing it to the right person. This is cool because not only is it something that is helping finance, but in addition to that, we now have a way for the business to own this. So it doesn't just have to be IT intervention if the OCR is reading something inaccurately or if something needs to be tweaked. We now have the ability, and it's actually got a user interface within this new engine we're using, to be able to let the business owner or the process owner go in and tweak that OCR. So if it thought this was the total, but really that is the total, we can have them directly go into the user interface and fix that so that the next time this comes in, that OCR engine can appropriately read, extract, and route those invoices. So pretty cool story. I will tell you, for lease accounting alone, they were spending about 20 hours a week opening mail for one person. And ideally, we can free that person up to help the accounting team, maybe to process statements or to do other things within lease accounting instead of opening mail, reading it, and routing it. So we're really excited about the power of this OCR engine. And we're not done. So we are now looking from the entire purview of financial services to figure out how might we leverage this in other ways? How might we use this in spite of or instead of the ERP OCR engine to increase that accuracy? How might we use this in other ways? And then in addition to that, what is the power of this if we could extract that data and start to get some of this data into the data lake in order to really take the power of the OCR engine and put it together with data? What might that do? We're really excited about the power of that, but we're still on a journey there.
That's a fantastic story. I mean, we always think of OCR as bots with eyes, not just optical character recognition. And then, this story has the transformation of ERPs going from, big iron installed to the cloud, and all of the big ERP vendors that have grown up on the installed basis are moving, and that's changing how much of this work needs to be done. I like the self-repair or the ability for the business to own it, make the changes, and continue to build. I don't know if you refer to them as templates, or update and make the templates smarter for the next time. That's a great story. Wanted to jump back onto the discussion about the roles. You talked about data stewards, business stewards, this idea of pouring and training it to people. I want you to talk a little bit about how successful have these roles been, what's worked, maybe what's not working so well, and what are you learning from this as people are focused on some of these different areas, or focused in a way that's differently organized than things were in the past?
Certainly. One of the things that we recognized early on as a team of two from the beginning, it was that we knew we couldn't do it all. The power of sitting in this unique intersection of the edge of financial services, but also on the edge of IT, is that we can help and instigate, but we knew we needed others to come alongside to help. We weren't the only technical people that sat in this organization. And so as we started to look around finance, a couple of the groups that we really tapped upon were, we created a team called Automation Champions. Automation Champions sit on the teams. They have not moved. Their role is the same within a day-to-day context. But what we've done is we've empowered them and continued to pour into them so that they can help their teams being those process owners, because they sit one layer closer to the work than even Financial Solutions Lab does. So those automation champions can help the process owners articulate their processes. That was one of the opportunities that we found, was process owners are really good at telling you what their pain points are, but it's sometimes difficult to tell you an end-to-end story of their process, because they want to sit in the exceptions, in the areas that are really the most painful for them. So we've started to leverage these automation champions to really help articulate those stories and even document those stories better than we had in the past. And then those automation champions have the ear of their leadership teams. They're actually reviewing those automation opportunities or those pain points with their leadership teams and telling us what's most important to them. And then they're able to funnel it to us in Financial Solutions Lab, and we can kind of compile all of those across financial services to say, what is the most impactful, as well as going back to that 66,000 hour goal. What's going to save us the most time across financial services? And let's go tackle that. So the automation champions have been a big piece of that. But in addition to that, we've actually created another role called data stewards. So these data stewards are oftentimes going back to those three roles within our data lake of business owner, technical steward, and business steward. The business steward is often the same thing as a data steward. And so we realized once we started to get in this automation journey that we had to double down on data, because if we could again get that data centralized and readily available, we could kind of change the shape of what reporting and ultimately work looks like. Because if you have the data, you're able to make different decisions than if you were having to go through the user interface every single time. So automation champions help us to really funnel, prioritize, articulate use cases, but then the data stewards come alongside to really help us narrow the scope of automation, because we can now use the power of data to really think through what's next. What does work look like? And ultimately help us tell those data stories that help us get towards automation as well.
I think that's a great story. I do want to ask about data governance and data tables, but I know you have another story about invoice coders, and maybe you could give us a little bit of background on this. So, what was the situation, and what was the learning?
Certainly. So invoice coding or invoice processing is something that is an age-old story. Nobody likes putting coding on invoices. Nobody likes getting those through the system, but it has to be done, and we do that, as many organizations do, prior to payment. And so an invoice comes in, an invoicer, we actually call them AP processors, are taking a look at that invoice, reading that invoice, and then trying to figure out what the coding is based on what was budgeted previously, and then routing that through the business for approval and ultimately payment back to the vendor. And so as you think about that, we actually centralized all of that invoice coding a few years ago. So we said we really want the business being restaurant development and IT and finance and all these different teams, we wanted them to focus on their unique value add, and we would actually have a team of AP processors that would code those invoices for them. So those AP processors are very knowledgeable of what data comes through, what invoices come through, and where those should go within the business from a routing and an invoice perspective. But as you think about that, the loop and the volume was ever expanding, because as we are a growing company and we are thinking about ways to do things differently and new ventures and all the different things, growing stores, that invoice volume continued to grow almost by the day. And so we were having to hire more and more people to process these same invoices and to be able to consume and get through all that volume. So then we went back to the drawing board, and we said, if we could create an ideal process for this, what would it look like? And in our heads, ideally, the invoice processors or invoice coders would focus on the feedback loop instead of actually doing the tasks within the system. Instead of coding those invoices, they would actually focus on making sure that everything was in alignment with budget. They would focus with the business approvers and making sure that we had the right coding in there. They would help tax to make sure that we didn't have any tax holds or things that had been inaccurately categorized. They would work with our fixed assets team and make sure that all of these were categorized correctly in order to look from an assets perspective. And so that was our goal, was think from the feedback loop perspective and align the invoice coder effort and work effort with the feedback loop instead of the actual manual tasks. So what that's allowed us to do is to take a look at where might RPA and other automation solutions help this effort. If we were to focus on that feedback loop, what would automation do? So as an invoice comes in, we are actually using a new OCR engine to take a look at that, an OCR engine that has really accurate data, and we are then using that data to help us code and key invoices, in addition to machine learning, as well as some predictive models that we've built behind the scenes based on historical coding. And then we are having RPA go in and code those invoices and route them out to the business. So what the opportunity there is that the manual effort is now done through automation, whereas those great insights and learnings and the approvals all remain as they exist today, but maybe we can strengthen those and focus more on that side of things instead of the actual manual transactions.
So I have a question on the feedback loop. You described a couple examples of that. I just want to make sure I understood what was meant. So it sounded to me like the feedback loop included, proper GL classification, proper fixed asset recording, compliance with tax, et cetera. So it's it's the overall quality control assurance categorization. Is that fair? Am I missing something?
That's correct. And so one of the things that we realized quickly was you could never get AP processing to zero from an exceptions perspective. There will always be exceptions and always be reasons why we have to do something differently. But in an exception-heavy environment, how do you limit the number of exceptions or limit the number of actual transactions so that the AP coder can focus on those exceptions? The exceptions should get less and less as you get more informed over time so that the coding can actually in an ideal world, the code, you have the codes, you receive the invoice, you code the invoice, and you move on. But there are so many pieces of why that's a more complex process than that, and that's where that feedback loop actually helps.
Camille, I wanted to shift. I know this is about the future of work, and I want to ask some questions about the future of data and data governance because, historically, the idea of the principle of least privilege, people only have access to what they need to have, wasn't really an issue because there was cabinets everywhere that were locked. Stuff was stored on paper. We couldn't access stuff very well. And now as more and more activity has moved to the network or to the cloud, more and more that's pouring in there, and there could be an overabundance of access. And the principle of least privilege is vital to prevent external theft, to manage what's going on so that people have access to what they need. How are you thinking about this idea of data governance? You're trying to make the democratization of analysis, the ability to access these things more broadly, but that has to come with some structure and the principle of least privilege and some guidance for a lot of reasons. I don't know if you want to share just a little bit about how you're thinking about it, and I know that would be instructive for people that may not even be involved in data. They may be treasury professionals, payables professionals, business leaders. Can you talk us through some of your thinking on that?
Yeah, great question. And this was kind of the concern, especially in financial services from the beginning, is if you couldn't have the right access, you have the wild, wild west of data wrangling. And that's not really what we are trying to instill. We're trying to instill that data governance. And so just as you said, the way of the past was you only had the key to that kingdom if you actually needed access to that filing cabinet. The same exists for our data lake and our data storage today. So by default, no one has access to your tables. So you get data in there and you do into the data lake and you say, okay, from the start, no one has access. And then we actually have a platform or a portal that everyone can go on and you can see the tables out there that exist, but those tables are also classified by different classifications. So there may be business public information, business sensitive information, or business confidential information. Business confidential information is things like, for us as a private company, cash is business confidential. There are very few people that need to know that data, need to know all of the details behind that data. Anyone can go out into the portal and see that the cash table is out there, but what they can't see is what are the actual transactions behind that. And so we have gotten to a point where the the portal that we're using actually stores all this pertinent information so that you can actually see what's out there but can't necessarily action upon it without a good business case. An example of this is store GPS coordinates. That's probably business public, because if I could go out onto the internet and ultimately figure out the GPS coordinates of one of our stores, that is something that could probably be readily available throughout the organization without any business sensitivity needs to be put around it. So as you think about that, we've been very careful to think about sensitivity level, but also going back to those 3 roles within the organization. We talked about the data owner, the business steward, and the technical steward. That data owner is the one who grants access. So in the instance of our accounts payable data, the accounts payable leader is the one that is that data owner. And so he or she can go in there, and if somebody wants access to that table, they have to grant access as the data owner to say, yes, I agree with their business case, and this is something that they could see. But specifically for store GPS coordinates, that's a business public item, we believe. And so once we got that into the data lake, the cool part about that is now I can take my finance reports that I was generating previously that just had store number on them, and now I can visualize them with Tableau or other visualization software to actually put balances or numbers on a map associated with those stores. So the power of having that as business public is almost as cool as the opportunity and the data governance that we can do within these tools, because we do want that data to be readily available where possible and where necessary, but also thinking about the sensitivity level and making sure we have the right controls in place to monitor and ultimately store our data in the same places, but have it in a way that only those that need to see that data can see it.
Now I'm going to ask you a question. You can say I'm not going to answer that, but it's the idea of a data lake is made up of file cabinets with drawers, with folders, with subfolders, with individual items. There's a structure to where everything sits, and the structure, this hierarchical structure, is where you put things. Some of that data is highly structured. It's tables, like you said, spreadsheets, rows, columns. Some of that's semi-structured, like a log of access to a system or a directory. There's other examples. Then there's these unstructured files. It could be videos. It could be images. Is that it seems that it would be pretty easy to manage this data governance on the structured side because you're classifying it, like you said, public, semi-public, whatever, business confidential. But how are you using much of the semi-structured and unstructured in your data lake currently, and are you using the same? You have access to this drawer, this file folder. Is that how that's being managed?
Yeah, it's a great question. So actually, I haven't gone to this depth, but our data lake has almost like a silver, gold, platinum level of structure and level of review. And so some of those tables, like bank data, it comes in, it's a pretty set format, it's pretty structured, it's not going to change much over time. Well, maybe that goes directly to platinum because we've built the pipes, and that is actually the table and the front end that you can see in our data lake portal. But you're right. What about maybe our ERP logs? Those will come in. Those then, with the help of IT, will come in as a data, let's just say silver level. And we know that in order to utilize that data from a business process perspective, it has to be structured. It has to ultimately get to that structured level. And so we have processes in place that will cleanse that data upon a few steps and then ultimately get it to that front end view that would be seen in the data lake. All of the access at the data lake level that's in our portal is actually once it's fully been cleansed. So we don't oftentimes show that unstructured data at the front end level, but it does exist in there, and we acknowledge that not everything is going to come in easily and is going to be perfect format and is going to be the way we want it. There's a lot of cleansing that has to happen. And then, but one of the things that we've tried to keep really intact is the fact that we want it to come in its raw form, whatever that raw form is, because if you have to build before you ever get it into your data storage, all these pipes that check, fix the date, parse this out, take the commas out of it, remove the $sign, it's going to be really difficult to maintain over time. So we do try to maintain the structure from the perspective of the raw format in the data lake. And then that's where we would leverage tools on the downstream side, whether that be Alteryx or Tableau or any of these tools that we're using from an analyst perspective. That's really where a lot of the cleansing and the views may happen, so that your team doesn't necessarily see that raw format. But we try to maintain the data integrity throughout the data lake so that we don't have to necessarily maintain all the pipes and cleansing that would happen at the analyst level.
Camille, you've told a lot of good stories in this discussion about the future of work, the future of tools and optimizing what people are doing is a great story. Now, just at the end, I'd love it if you have any closing remarks that you'd like to leave us with.
Yeah, I think I always, when I listen to something or when I hear somebody speak, I want to know how I can action upon it right now. And so the opportunity here is that we are all on a journey. Chick-fil-A is still on that journey. We don't have it all figured out. But one of the things we realized pretty early on was that from a finance perspective, there weren't many that were already on this journey ahead of us. There were many that were in the same seat trying to figure out, how do we store data? How do we automate? How do we free up capacity? And so one of the opportunities here is to really start to be that catalyst within your organization to say, hey, we need to really think about who sits at that intersection of finance and IT. Think about who is already got those technical skills and elevate that group of people, because ultimately they're already probably poised and ready to go and they're on the brink of breakthrough. But how can you enable that is really the cool power of this. This is not a bunch of people that sit really far from finance, and it requires going out and getting data engineers and all these really complex skill sets. This is really about taking your data to the very next step, or taking your automation to the very next step, coming up with some of those vision casting of what do you want the future to look like, and then figuring out what bite-sized pieces or what bite-sized bites you need to take in order to get those pieces broken off for the future of your work.
I like it. Camille, thank you so much for your comments and being generous with your time today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Craig.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.